Does God exist? Are science and faith enemies? Your host for this series was an atheist who became a believer in God through his studies in science. Here is public high school teacher John Clayton.
In the first two presentations of this series of videos, we took a look at a logical argument for the existence of God. And I want to emphasize in this particular presentation, it's assumed that you have looked at the first two videos. Now, if you haven't done that, it might be a good idea to go back and look at the first two programs, because otherwise you may sort of get the idea this is a God of gaps argument, that we're saying that somehow we invented God to explain what we don't understand. And that's not the argument. You'll see that we have started out on the assumption that the viewer is willing to accept the fact that they exist, that there is reality. We then have looked at the question of, if there is reality, there are two choices about how that reality came into existence. Choice number one is that it had a beginning. Choice number two is that it did not have a beginning. And we looked at quotes from both religious and atheist sources that indicated that those two choices, in fact, pretty well summarized the approaches that might be made by both orientations. We then looked at the question of, okay, if there was a beginning, because scientific evidence supports that point, and we demonstrated the evidence in the first video, then the question is it caused or is it not caused? And we saw that suggesting that it is not caused puts you in a position of really denying all of science. So from that point, we want to move on to say, okay, if we accept the idea there was a beginning, that scientifically we believe that can be ascertained, and if we accept the logic that says that the beginning was caused, what was the cause? And I would suggest to you that there are two logical choices about that cause. Choice number one is that the cause was caused by something that's personal. That would suggest an intelligence that created the creation with purpose and with order and with logic and with design. The other alternative is that the universe is a product of chance, that everything is the result of rote mechanistic accident. Design demands a designer. Plan demands a planner. And the opposite of that is to assume that everything is the product of chance. One of the interesting quotes on this is a quote by Julian Huxley. And as you read that, I'd like to point out to you that this is a beautiful statement of the alternative to the concept that there is design and purpose and order in the creation. I've seen this statement in science textbooks. Being a high school science teacher in the public schools, I've always been kind of interested that it was there, because it really isn't a statement of science. It's really a statement of religion. As a matter of fact, Huxley has made references to that. One of his relatives made this statement based upon his ideas, and I think it's kind of interesting to notice that he readily admits that the motivation for assuming there is no meaning, no purpose, no design in the creation is a philosophical religious purpose. I think the end statement there is so obvious. The philosophy of meaninglessness was essentially an instrument of liberation, sexual and political. I think that's an accurate statement. But that really isn't the purpose of our discussion. What I'd like to do is to show you that this first statement that assumes that everything is the result of a long series of singularly beneficial accidents is not scientifically reasonable, that there is good, solid, logical evidence from science that there is purpose, that there is design, that there is intelligence in the creation. And I would like to show this to you in the next couple of programs on 4 levels. And the level we'd like to approach in this discussion is the one that's listed first on this series, on an intuitive level. Now later on we'll talk about some mathematical analysis. Later on we'll talk about some of the complexities that come that can be statistically analyzed. But in this discussion, what we're interested in is the concept that in fact there are some things that you just look at and you have to say, boy, is it really reasonable to believe that what we're looking at can possibly be the product of blind, rote, mechanistic chance. So let me show you a couple of my favorite examples. There's not going to be any heavy statistical analysis here. I'm not suggesting there aren't other alternative views that might be expressed on this, but I ask you to think about whether or not these things can really and truly be viewed logically as a product of chance. And one of my all-time favorites is the question of migration. And the best example of migration that we could give is, I think, the Arctic tern. The Arctic tern is an incredible living thing. The Arctic tern spends their summers on the north slopes of Alaska and Canada. In the fall of the year, they take off and they fly 12,000 miles to the southern edge of South America. And then the following spring, they fly 12,000 miles back. 24,000 miles. That round trip distance is the circumference of the earth. And the question is, what really allows them to do this? When you look at the tern, it doesn't look any different than most other living things. And as a matter of fact, what we have discovered is that many of the abilities that this little bird has are present in all living things in one form or another. And one of the first proposals that people gave of this was that maybe the tern just sees their way down there, that they move from one landmark to the other. And so they do it by sight. So they've equipped Arctic terns with contact lenses, which made them so nearsighted they couldn't see past the end of their beak. So they couldn't possibly pick up landforms and follow geographic identities to make their way from the north slopes of Alaska to the southern edge of South America. But even completely deprived of the sense of sight, the birds were able to make the journey. Another suggestion was that maybe they hear their way. You know, they listen to the wind blowing through the mountain passes. They hear waves lapping up on the shore, and so they use sound to make the journey. So they equipped terns with their own set of private headphones, essentially, which provided extraneous sounds that would drown out any noise they could possibly use. And they were still able to make the journey. Somebody else suggested, well, maybe they're smelling their way down there. And so they equipped a tern essentially with its own private gas mask. And completely given the wrong sense of odors, they were able to make the journey. Somebody else suggested that perhaps it's the Earth's magnetic field that they're following. And so they equipped Arctic terns with magnetic scramblers that would louse up their magnetic field. And they were still able to make the journey. And I'm sure most of our viewers are aware that these same kinds of experiments have been done with whales. They've been done with all kinds of other living things. And the bottom line, what comes out to us in this discussion is that apparently this process of being able to make the journey is not just one system. Apparently there's more than one system, and when one system gets loused up, they're able to use another system. Now, the question is, how did these systems come about? Because the nesting capabilities of these birds are dependent upon being able to make the journey. And it's interesting also to understand that diet is not an issue here. Somebody might say, well, they can only eat one kind of food, and the only place the food grows is up here on the north slopes and down there on the southern edge of South America. And so they have to make the journey to secure the food. But the tern is a scavenger. They're a very wide-range food source eater. They're omnivore. They can eat plant type of things. They can eat fish. They can eat corn. I mean, I've had experience with terns working at camps in Canada in which I have discovered a large number of variety of things that terns will eat. They'll steal worms out of your fishing bucket. They'll eat birdseed off the bird feeder. This isn't a bird that has a narrow kind of diet. They can only eat one kind of birdseed. But I would suggest to you there are three possible explanations about how this living thing acquires its ability. And I believe these tests could be applied to any kind of migration study of whales or of ducks or geese or eels or turtles or anything you might like to talk about. And the first of these three alternatives is that they learn this. See, the idea is that perhaps the terns are educated by their parents.